Katsuki only showered in the barest sense of the word, running hot water over his body and scrubbing the sweatiest parts of his body with the fucking stupid flowery hand soap. Only because it was the least terrible scent option and he knew he reeked. That done, he toweled off and tugged on a set of comfortable, clean clothes. He took his suppressants and headed down to breakfast, even though he only had about 10 minutes before visitation hours began. Sundress Girl flagged him down as he walked in the door, pointing at a tray with salmon and a blanched spinach and sesame salad. She was grinning, proud that she'd managed to save him a trip through the line. Since he was already short on time, Bakugou figured whatever food Arakaki had reserved for him would probably be enough. He plopped down across from her and took the salmon, grumbling a quick, "Thanks." Only because he figured he should at least acknowledge the gesture. That done, he began stuffing his face. He'd finished both pieces of salmon and had just picked up half of the spinach in one massive bite when a staff person wandered over to their table. Katsuki felt his stomach clench, even though he knew on a logical level that Kirishima had reserved all of the visitations. Seeing a staff person come to tell him about the visit still put him on edge. Besides, what if Kirishima was a no-show? Would they give the slots to someone else? Fuck, he hoped that wasn't the case. "You have a reserved visitation at 8. The staff member told him, their hair hanging over one side of their face. "Will you be taking it in the parlor or your room?" "Can we meet in the socialization room and go from there?" Katsuki asked, genuinely curious. Tilting their head slightly, the staff person eyed Katsuki. "As long as the Alpha is satisfied with that arrangement, I don't see a problem." They finally answered. "I'll make sure the Alpha knows of your preference." With that, the individual wandered off, probably to talk to Kirishima. Arakaki raised an eyebrow in his direction. "Not going straight to the bedroom?" "Yeah, well, it turned into a fucking disaster when we tried that yesterday." Katsuki shot back, a bit more harshly than was probably necessary. Not that he was going to apologize for that, since more harsh than necessary was practically his tagline. "I figured we might try talking first today, so I can get him to fucking chill." Arakaki sniggered at that. "I can't argue with that logic," she replied. "But finish your breakfast before you go." Bakugou rolled his eyes, cramming the huge bite of spinach in his mouth and chewing pointedly. He finished the rest of the salad in a second, equally monstrous bite. "Show me your teeth," Arakaki commanded. Katsuki stared at her like she just told him to rob a bank. "Fucking why?" he asked. "Because you just ate spinach and it might be stuck on your teeth," Arakaki replied, sounding vaguely exasperated. "Do you have breath mints? You don't really have time to go back and brush your teeth." "No, I don't have fucking breath mints," Katsuki snapped. "Why does that even matter?" "Because kissing with fish breath is gross," Arakaki told him, quickly moving from vague exasperation to outright irritation. "Have you never kissed anyone before?" "I don't see how that's any of your fucking business," Katsuki hissed. "Holy shit, that question was supposed to be rhetorical," Arakaki said faintly. "I didn't think you really hadn't kissed anyone before this Alpha." "Fuck you." Katsuki didn't really have a substantial response to her accusation. His face was burning with what was probably embarrassment, but he was going to call it anger because it felt safer than admitting Arakaki had gotten to him. "Here." Arakaki passed him a small container of mints. "Use these. I have more time to brush my teeth than you." "Fine," Bakugou griped, accepting the mints, albeit grudgingly. He might use them. That didn't mean he was going to do it right there in front of her. What if he wanted coffee? The mints would make the shitty swell taste that much worse. He'd keep them in his pocket for later, though, because he imagined bad coffee and fish would probably make for a subpar overall kissing experience, and considering how flighty Kirishima was, he could use all the help he could get. "I'm leaving now," he told Arakaki, who smiled up at him with a predatory grin. Go get him, Tiger, she said, which was an amusingly dated phrase, considering she was probably younger than Kotsky by a year or two. Yet it seemed to convey an oddly appropriate sentiment. Kotsky grinned back, putting as much intent into his expression as he could muster. It must have worked, because a look of surprise danced across Arakiki's features, closely followed by an approving nod. She gave him a thumbs up. You got this. Much as he loathed to admit it, Kotsky appreciated the vote of confidence. Ichiro hated waiting. He'd never been particularly good at sitting back and doing nothing, and knowing that the people in this place didn't give a fuck about Bakugou certainly didn't help matters. Was he all right? Did he still have his suppressants? Was he getting enough food? Did he get in trouble for the broken door? That alpha wasn't around, was he? He probably didn't have overnight privileges. Those were expensive, and filling out all the paperwork to approve something like that was time-consuming. Bakugou was probably fine. Ichiro was just getting himself worked up over nothing. Oi. The gruff voice of Bakugou barked out from behind him, startling him from his reverie. Ichiro spun on his heel, feeling the tension in his chest ease at the sound of that voice, but his anxiety spiked again as soon as he laid eyes on Bakugou. What happened? He gasped, reaching out to grab him before freezing, not sure if Bakugou wanted physical contact or not. You look terrible. Ah, yes, just what every man wants to hear from his lover first thing in the morning. Bakugou drawled, looking vaguely pissed. Not that this was an unusual expression by any means, but Ichiro still felt like he was missing something. Did something happen? He asked in a small voice, almost afraid to hear the answer. Was there a reason you never texted me back last night? Bakugou growled, folding his arms over his chest and eyeing him with a particularly vicious stare. Oh shit. Had he forgotten to reply? Ichiro fumbled his phone out, blarily remembering he texted Midoriya after Bakugou agreed to cooperate, but... Oh. Damn. He really hadn't responded. And Bakugou had... Oh, hell. He'd said something really sweet, too. In his rush to figure out what to do about that Adachi guy, he'd missed the real subtext of Bakugou saying something like, I can count on you. But now that he was reading it in the light of day, his cheeks flared red as the full significance of the message sank in. Bakugou trusted him, relied on him, and he'd just not responded. Left him hanging, after he'd made himself vulnerable. Saying something like, I trust you might not seem to be much for most people, but Bakugou didn't trust easily, and to just say nothing after Bakugou had said something so genuine, it must have been unnerving to say the least. Ichiro looked up at Bakugou, fully aware his face was burning and probably as red as his hair. I fell asleep. It was pathetic, and it was only really half of the truth, but it was the more relevant part as far as Ichiro could tell. Bakugou blinked. You fucking... He sighed, lifting the arm folded over the other to his face, pinching the bridge of his nose and taking a deep breath. You fell asleep. It wasn't a question, but Ichiro found himself nodding anyway. I'm so sorry, he apologized. Wow. He was so embarrassed. Plus, he was beginning to suspect that the reason Bakugou looked so terrible was actually because of his mistake. I don't know what to say, he admitted after an awkward pause. Bakugou sighed, lifting his head to glare at Kirishima. Yeah, obviously. He turned his sharp gaze to the cell phone still clutched in Ichiro's hand and raised an eyebrow. That was a bit heavy-handed, but it got the point across. Kirishima would have gladly crammed his entire foot in his mouth to avoid making things worse, but he was just bad at this whole communicating thing, apparently. He'd never thought he was that bad at it until the last few days, but now he was starting to realize that he really should be more careful, cautious, thoughtful. Yeah, he needed to think about what he wanted to say before just blurting things out, because once he said something, he couldn't really take it back. He looked down at his cell phone, which Bakugou had just indicated, and lifted it slightly. It means a lot to me, though. He fumbled a bit, trying to figure out how to express his thoughts, lamely settling for what you said, in the message that I didn't answer. He could tell that he'd definitely not picked his words well this time, because Bakugou was looking at him like something he'd found stuck to the bottom of his shoe. His expression held a sort of detached disgust bordering on anger. You. Bakugou folded his arms again, then unfolded them, fingers twitching like he wanted to send a few crackles across his palms, but he was restraining himself, barely. Thanks, I guess. I mean it, though. Ichiro was trying desperately to rectify the situation, even as he felt his control of the conversation slipping away the longer it continued. It was so touching. So touching that you read it and immediately thought to yourself, "Ah, yes, that message was so touching that I can go to sleep peacefully without fucking answering him like a goddamn asshole." Bakugou's hands were curled into claws, his self-restraint frayed to the point that Ichiro was impressed that he hadn't actually blown anything up yet. He seemed to be teetering on the edge, though, and Ichiro genuinely didn't know how to talk him down. This was all his fault, and everything he said just seemed to make it worse. Why was he so bad at this? Covering his face with his hands, he tried to think. His backpack was cutting into his shoulders, his heart pounding, and all he could think was how damn stupid it was that his lack of response to Bakugou's message of trust had in turn damaged that trust. And how the hell was he supposed to fix that? He couldn't, and he didn't know what to do about it either. With a sigh, he shed the backpack, dropping it to the floor with a solid thunk, of half a mind to flop into the nearest chair and just not try, because everything he tried just seemed to piss Bakugou off that much more. What the hell's in that thing? Bakugou was staring at the backpack like it had sprouted legs and started walking around the room. Kirishima blinked, glancing between the bag and Bakugou. Just some stuff I brought, he said, trying desperately to aim for casual and failing miserably. Bakugou glanced between him and the bag, eyes narrowing in suspicion. Stuff, he repeated, obviously not satisfied with such a vague answer. Yeah, just, Kirishima decided that in this case, actions might be a better option than trying to use his words. He dropped beside the bag and began rifling through it, pulling out the coffee and filters first, setting them out on the nearest table before returning to the backpack, speaking all the while. I brought your coffee since you said you don't like the stuff here, he said. And then I remembered you were mad about the food, so I grabbed some of your protein powder. He placed it on the table next to the coffee. Bakugou was frowning at the stuff on the table, not an angry scowl, but a baffled glare like he didn't understand why that stuff was in the backpack, and he wasn't sure how to feel about it. While he was puzzling through that, Ichiro continued to unpack the stuff he'd brought. Oh, and I brought your shower stuff too because you didn't like the stuff they have here, Ichiro added, pulling out the toiletries. And then I thought I'd bring some of your weights too, since you've probably gotten tired of doing the same routine for like 3 days. He lifted one weight out of the backpack, considered the pile of things on the table, and carefully returned it to the backpack. No point in just dumping random weights on the table. He could leave those in the backpack until they got to Bakugou's room. If they got to Bakugou's room. What the fuck is all this? Bakugou demanded finally. When the hell did you even get this shit? Oh, last night, Ichiro answered. I wanted to be sure I got it for you before I forgot, and then I carried it all home. Oh, I probably could have just gone to your place this morning, but I didn't think of all that stuff until I was already there, so... He shrugged. I just wanted you to feel more comfortable. Bakugou was looking at him now, not glaring, not frowning, just looking, evaluating him. Huh, he said gruffly, ducking his head and brushing his fingers across the coffee filters thoughtfully. So you... He cleared his throat, swallowing hard, and glanced up at Ichiro, his scarlet eyes softening ever so slightly. You were thinking of me then? Of course I was thinking of you, Ichiro exclaimed. I care about you. I think about you all the time. Bakugou tilted his head ever so slightly. Right. Just not when you fall asleep. Although the accusation was nearly identical to the one he'd made minutes earlier, this time his mouth was twitching with the hint of a smile. Sheepishly, Ichiro scrubbed at the back of his neck. Yeah, sorry again, he said. Bakugou sighed gustily. I guess that's just one of the hazards of dating a fucking idiot. It was unkind, at least on the surface, but Bakugou said it with such fondness that Ichiro was really struggling to take offense. Instead, he just feigned a wounded expression. Hey, I'm not an idiot. Bakugou grinned. But you are dating me. Ichiro bit his lip nervously. If you'll have me, he said. I know I didn't do so great last night, but I'll try. Oi! Bakugou cut him off. Fuck that. I was just... hell. I screwed with my own head and then acted like it was all on you. It wasn't all you. I fucked up too. Ichiro nodded slowly. Okay, good. Sorry, anyway. Don't worry about it. Bakugou replied and scooped up the coffee Ichiro had brought him. I'm going to make some coffee. You want some? Grinning, Ichiro returned the rest of the items to his bag and slung it over his shoulder once more. Okay. Bakugou stomped off in the direction of the hot water, and Ichiro trailed behind him, the warmth of fond gratitude blooming in his chest. He wasn't sure how exactly, but it seemed like they'd resolved that issue. He just hoped that he'd learn how to communicate better in the future. Once Katsuki had made himself the first decent cup of coffee he'd had in days, he and Kirishima wandered back across the socialization room to a few chairs. The heavy backpack once more hit the floor with an ominous thunk, though at least now Katsuki knew why it was so damn heavy. He glanced at Kirishima over the rim of his cup. His boyfriend. They were dating, right? Kirishima hadn't objected to Bakugou saying they were dating, so it definitely counted, right? He could call Kirishima his boyfriend, probably. Fuck. Why was he so damn nervous about this shit? Was gazing back at him with a fond look in his eyes and a smile on his face. Katsuki cleared his throat awkwardly. Well, one of them had to start this conversation. It may as well be him. I need to know how far you're willing to go with me today, he said. Kirishima's face crinkled in confusion. Go? Like, on a trip? No, you idiot. I'm a fucking mandatory resident. Where the hell would I be going? Katsuki wondered. Instead, he settled for glaring at Kirishima until the other man took the hint. Oh, you mean how far to go? He emphasized the word in a tone that sounded way too fucking sexy coming out of his mouth. Katsuki wished he'd been recording the conversation, the rough, husky tone, the way Kirishima's voice had dipped into a sensual rumble on the word go. Fuck, he could probably enjoy himself thoroughly with the recording of that sentence and maybe an article of clothing that smelled like him, because seriously, hot damn. Still, now was not the time to get distracted. Yeah. What are you going to be okay with? You need to tell me, because I can't fucking go through the same shit as yesterday. He said, mostly because he hadn't fucking slept and had absolutely zero emotional energy remaining after the whole debacle with the fucking unanswered message. He didn't want to fight about fucking boundaries again, so he figured that since Kirishima was the one with the hang-ups, he should be the one to establish exactly how far they were going. Katsuki was not going to fight him again. Instead, he would just fucking walk away, because he was too tired for this shit right now. Kirishima took a moment to consider Katsuki's request, his face thoughtful. Finally, he said, I don't want to take things too far, but... Two spots of color on his cheeks began to spread as he continued. I did, bring condoms. A tension that had been clenching in Katsuki's chest seemed to dissipate at those words. Fucking finally. But wait, This was still Kirishima, so he should probably make sure. "So then we're doing this," he said carefully. Not exactly a question, but also not quite a statement. Well, you said you wanted to," Kirishima squeaked. "Suck my dick, and I thought we should be careful and..." Wait, hold up. Bakugou felt his chest clench. Surely he hadn't been reading this whole situation wrong. "You want me to use a condom for oral sex?" Why? Had Kirishima... Fuck. Katsuki had never heard Kirishima talk about other lovers, but the guy wasn't exactly the type to kiss and tell, so maybe... Damn it. Maybe he was actually more experienced than Katsuki. Maybe he'd been with other people. But if that was the case, wouldn't he have gotten tested? So he would probably know if he was clean, right? Fuck. Had Kirishima slept with other people while Katsuki had been busy bemoaning the fact that Kirishima wasn't with him? Fuck. Kirishima's face was bright red and his eyes were wide with panic. "Is that not... I always thought, safe sex and all." His voice was weak. "I honestly have no idea how this works," he admitted after a moment. "I've never, I don't know anything." He covered his face with both hands. "So, no condoms?" "I mean, I've never had sex with anyone," Katsuki pointed out dryly. "So if you haven't either, then there's no pressing reason to use a condom for oral sex." He ignored the way his chest tightened ever so slightly at the last statement. Of course Kirishima hadn't been with anyone else. He'd just said as much. And why was it such a fucking big deal if he had? This was not where his mind should be anyway. He was supposed to be explaining that latex was not what he wanted in his mouth. He wanted Kirishima. "Unless you want to leave a bad taste in my mouth, in which case condoms are a great idea," he added, sneering a little. No fucking way was he using a condom. He wanted to taste Kirishima, had wanted to taste him for years. "Oh my god, how can you talk about this with a straight face?" Kirishima gasped out, peeking through his fingers up at Katsuki. "So you don't want to use a condom then?" "Not for oral sex," Katsuki clarified. "With the whole suppressant fuck-up, though, I think the extra protection would be good for nodding." Kirishima choked on what was probably just saliva, his face turning bright red. "I'm not really sure we're there yet," he gasped, eyes darting around the room like he couldn't bear to look at Katsuki. "Let's stick with, other stuff," he stammered, finally turning back to look at Katsuki with wide eyes. "You're not just saying that?" Katsuki pressed, determined to get a straight answer out of Kirishima. "Because I can't fucking... Yesterday sucked. I can't do that again." Rather than agree right away, Kirishima took his time, carefully considering. "If you really want to do that," he said slowly, "then it's okay with me." Unexpectedly, Katsuki felt a rush of irritation. "Look, you have to be more specific than that. There's a million fucking things that could mean. Tell me exactly what you're okay with and what you're not okay with." "Oh god," Kirishima whimpered then. "If you wanna suck my dick..." He cut himself off with a half yelp, cleared his throat, and tried again. "If you want to put your mouth on me, anywhere on my body, then it's okay." "Anywhere?" Katsuki pressed. "Anywhere," Kirishima agreed, though his face grew uncertain. "Why?" "So if I wanted to eat you out?" Katsuki began, watching Kirishima carefully. Swallowing hard, his crimson eyes locked on Katsuki's face, Kirishima replied, "If you want to, then it's okay with me." He bit down lightly on his lower lip, sharp teeth pressing into the soft flesh. I can't promise I'll be into it, but I'm willing to try. He elaborated after a moment. That's good enough, Kotsky told him. No one has to like everything, but so long as you're okay. He took a deep breath. What about me? What about you? Kirishima asked, his eyebrows scaling his forehead, a frown of confusion on his face. If I asked you for something, how far would you go? Kotsky asked. He gripped his hands together and willed them not to shake. It was one thing for Kirishima to passively accept something, but Kotsky wanted more than a willing partner. He wanted an active participant. And if all Kirishima was going to do was lay there and take it, well, then Kotsky would rather not start anything. That would just leave him feeling even shittier than before. I guess as far as you, Kirishima said thoughtfully. I mean, I wouldn't mind tasting you either. His eyes widened as he realized what he just said, and he clapped a hand over his mouth, his face burning as crimson as his hair. He said something, but with his hand over his mouth, it was so muffled that Kotsky couldn't tell what he was trying to say. Care to repeat that? Kotsky asked. Kirishima replied, carefully removing his hand. I was just embarrassed, I guess, but the answer still stands. He added quickly. Kotsky nodded and took a careful sip of his coffee. You're sure? He asked. It was somewhat reassuring, but also incredibly stressful watching Kirishima carefully consider the question. Yeah. He finally agreed, ducking his head slightly and running a hand through his spiked eyesore of a haircut. I'm sure. Kotsky drained the rest of his coffee in a single gulp. Then let's fucking go, he insisted, standing. For a moment, he was terrified that Kirishima wasn't going to come, that it would be like yesterday and he was going to stay seated again and this whole bullshit was just going to be a repeat of the day before. Then Kirishima rose, a bright smile on his face, and he shouldered his backpack with surprising ease considering how heavy the damn thing had sounded when it hit the floor. Yeah, he said, a surprising gentleness in his tone. Let's go. Ichiro was expecting the hole in the wall of the room, knew that the cracks in the door frame were there, and had accepted that Bakugou was probably not ready to talk about that yet. He was also beginning to suspect that this was okay. Bakugou needed to decide for himself when the time was right to talk about that sort of thing. And worrying about Bakugou didn't necessarily mean that he had to put everything else between them on hold until the whole Alpha incident was resolved. In his own way, Kotsky had been trying to reach out to Ichiro, and he'd almost missed it, so wrapped up in his concern for Bakugou that he hadn't been entirely willing to listen to what Bakugou wanted. Of course, his flat dismissal yesterday at the idea of being in heat hadn't helped matters, but today felt different. Like they both realized that maybe slowing down and talking things through before jumping in was important. Though admittedly, Ichiro had realized there was a point where one needed to move forward from mere talking. They'd managed to strike a balance somewhere in there between communication and, well, yeah. Anyway, Bakugou agreeing to keep things lightish had helped Ichiro accept that whatever it was that had Bakugou so worked up, it probably had more to do with reclaiming his sexual agency than it did his heat. Especially since Bakugou had been so forthcoming about condoms probably being necessary for any sort of penetration that might involve the risk of pregnancy. Surprisingly, Bakugou's straightforward response had helped Kirishima feel more at ease with the situation as a whole, and that made it easier to recognize that Bakugou was making a lot of allowances to help Kirishima feel comfortable, and he should probably step up and do his part as well. Though really, it wasn't like agreeing to let Bakugou give him head was that much of a noble sacrifice. Bakugou shut the door behind himself, his eyes raking across Ichiro like he was seeing him for the first time, and really liked what he saw. How are we doing this? He demanded, taking a step forward. Ichiro took an involuntary step backward, half intimidated by the sheer intensity of Bakugou's gaze. Whatever you want, he said. Bakugou paused, his eyes narrowing. What I want is what you want. he said, his voice a low rumble that did things to Ichiro. Holy shit. Had his voice always been that sensual? Or was this something new that Ichiro was only just now discovering? Because, wow, it was really good. Really, really good. Oh, okay. Where do you want me then? Ichiro asked, then realized that wasn't really helping Bakugou if he was really expecting Ichiro to ask for something. Maybe, I'll just sit down. He squeaked, scooting back and dropping on Bakugou's bed. Oh, and I didn't wear my scent blocker today, so... I know. Bakugou rumbled, moving so fast he was practically a blur, straddling Ichiro's lap and leaning in to take a breath. Smells amazing, he said, his breath ghosting along Ichiro's neck, and, okay, yes, more of that please. Ichiro opened his mouth to say something to that effect, but instead what came out was a very indecent-sounding moan, followed by an incoherent string of words consisting mostly of yes, more, and shit. Of course, this only seemed to spur on Bakugou, who curled one hand up in Ichiro's hair, holding tight without pulling, while the other trailed down his chest, lingering briefly before moving downward once more. Ichiro felt like his skin was on fire everywhere Bakugou was touching him, his breath coming in great gulps. When Bakugou's hand in his hair trailed down to his shoulder, he didn't even try to resist the pressure that pushed him backwards, and he fell onto the bed entirely, his chest heaving like he'd been pumping iron, not just enjoying the attentions of his super hot, oh shit, boyfriend. Bakugou was actually his boyfriend, wasn't he? The thought, which had somehow escaped his notice until that moment, made itself clear in that instant, and it was glorious. His boyfriend, Bakugou. The tug at his waistband drew his attention back to the moment, and he realized Bakugou had shuffled back on his lap slightly, just enough to work at his belt buckle, releasing it and then fumbling with the button of his jeans. Fucking piece of shit, Bakugou cursed, obviously struggling with the pants. Damn it, he growled. Are you really attached to these fucking things? Bakugou, Ichiro yelped. Don't rip them. Or explode anything that close to me, for the love of God. He didn't add, but only because he knew Bakugou wasn't that reckless, though the fact that Bakugou could do it had still crossed his mind, however briefly. Fine, Bakugou groused, scooting back again until he dropped off the bed entirely, immediately pressing in between Kirishima's knees, getting closer to the button so that he could see it better. This thing is stupid, he huffed, then made a small huh of exultation a moment later as the button finally came loose. He tugged the zipper down, pulling Ichiro's pants open to reveal his bright red boxer shorts. Ichiro sat back, bracing himself on his elbow so he could see what Bakugou was doing, just in time to see him bend forward and mouth at the bulge in his underwear, inhaling deeply. His eyes flicked up to meet Ichiro's, and there was a hungry look in that gaze that made Ichiro's breath catch in his throat. A dangerous grin tugged at the corners of his lips as he opened wider, teasing at Ichiro's clothed length. His eyes danced, noting every sound Ichiro made, which happened to be quite a lot. Ichiro wasn't trying to be loud, but this was Bakugou Katsuki with his mouth on his. It was a dream come true, literally. He couldn't even begin to count how many times he'd imagined something like this, and reality was so much better than he'd ever dared to hope. He gasped as Bakugou moved up, licking a stripe up along his abs before hooking his finger around Kirishima's waistband and pulling at his pants. Lift your fucking hips, idiot, he grumbled, his breath puffing against Ichiro's stomach, and shit, why did that feel so good? He did what he was told, doing his best to arch his back and lift away from the bed. Bakugou didn't seem to mind helping either, using his own considerable strength to lift Ichiro's lower body up and tug the pants and boxers down below his ass before tugging them a bit lower until they were bunched up around his knees. Fuck it, Bakugou proclaimed, and then he pulled off Ichiro's pants entirely, followed by the boxers. At least he hadn't tried to take off his socks. And as they'd both shed their shoes before proceeding to the bedroom, the indoor slippers he had been wearing had come off easily once he hit the mattress, Honestly, Ichiro wasn't too worried about any of his clothes at the moment. He had much bigger things to concern himself with, mainly the fact that Bakugou was back between his legs, staring down at him. "Hey," Bakugou said, his eyes softening ever so slightly. "You're sure you're okay with this?" Ichiro wanted to scream. He wanted it. He wanted it with so much intensity he could practically taste his own desire. But he tried to restrain himself and answer honestly. "Yes, please, Bakugou. I want you so bad." He gasped out, which admittedly was not really the restrained answer he'd intended to give, but it was too late for that now. It seemed to do the trick, though, because Bakugou's mouth was on him in an instant, its wet heat surrounding him, drawing him in. Bakugou seemed to be a bit too excited, though, because within moments he choked, pulling away with a cough. "Fuck," he rasped. "I need to work on that," he said, then leaned back down, licking a stripe up the underside of Ichiro's, and Ichiro realized with confusion that he was laughing. Why was he laughing? "Why are you, laughing?" Ichiro managed, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He couldn't contain his reactions. Unfortunately, neither could Bakugou, it seemed. He pulled off of Ichiro, his lips making a wet pop as he fought to control the snort of laughter. "Fucking ridiculous," he half sneered, half chuckled. "You're so loud, it's fucking adorable." Oh shit, Bakugou had called him adorable. He could feel his face heating as what Bakugou said began to sink in. He called him adorable. If anyone had asked him if he'd like to be called adorable, he probably would have answered by saying he'd rather be called strong or manly or powerful. But there was a softness to Bakugou's tone when he said it, a fond warmth to his words that Ichiro wasn't sure he'd ever heard there before, and it seemed to burrow into his very core. And he was so inordinately pleased that Bakugou had called him adorable that he couldn't really find the words to describe it. Although that might have been due to the fact that finding words of any sort was growing more difficult as Bakugou returned to his menstruations. Wrapping his lips around Ichiro and drawing him deeper into the warm, wet heat. After that, his mind was so caught up in every sensation, every sound, every movement, that coherent thought seemed to slip away entirely. Before he realized what was happening, he could feel his body tensing in that certain way, and it was all he could do to yelp. "Gah," which was not at all what he was trying to say, but Bakugou pulled off him to ask, "What the fuck?" just as he came, so it achieved the intended purpose anyway. The force of his orgasm was so strong that he felt like he'd go boneless. Literally, that had happened before. There was this one time when a quirk user had literally turned him boneless during a fight. Fortunately, it had been reversed, but the whole experience had been uncomfortable and left him feeling like his body needed to recover from the sensation. So maybe it wasn't actually a perfect analogy, because he wasn't really uncomfortable so much as spent, utterly and satisfyingly. He still didn't move when he heard Bakugou leave the room, more because it felt like entirely too much effort to move his limbs at the moment, though his eyes tracked him as Bakugou moved into the bathroom and returned with a wet washcloth. Although he muttered under his breath as he worked, his touch was soft, carefully cleaning up the mess Ichiro had left all over himself, taking great care with his oversensitive body. Then Bakugou peeled off his shirt, which Ichiro had also managed to splatter, balled it up, and tossed it aside. He flopped onto the bed beside Ichiro, rolling over and gently carting a hand through his hair, probably running his gelled spikes, though Ichiro didn't really mind that nearly as much as he might have normally. "That was amazing," Ichiro finally said, when it seemed obvious that Bakugou was waiting for him to say something. "Really?" Bakugou huffed, scooting a little bit closer and pressing his nose into the base of Ichiro's throat, taking a deep breath before responding. "Good." Ichiro turned his head towards Bakugou, pressing a kiss to his forehead. "Thank you," he said softly, "for taking care of me." Bakugou snorted dismissively. "It was just..." "No. Ichiro interrupted him quickly. I mean, for being careful, for making sure I was comfortable, for listening to me. Clearing his throat, Bakugou looked away. Oh, that. I just don't see the fucking point of this if you aren't as into it as I am. Ichiro smiled. I'm glad you feel that way, he said softly before adding, and I'm definitely into it. At this, Bakugou burst out laughing. That's fucking obvious, he gasped. You were so damn loud. Ichiro felt his heart start to beat faster as the words sank in. Oh, he said quietly, his face already beginning to burn as he asked, exactly how loud are we talking? Rather than answering him, Bakugou just laughed harder. Ichiro tried to ignore that, as well as the telltale burn of a blush crawling across his cheeks, choosing instead to enjoy the sensation of Bakugou curled up beside him. It wasn't all that difficult.